We are happy to bring back to the Catholic Hour audience today the Right Reverend Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen of the Catholic University of America, who inaugurates a series of 17 addresses on the crises in Christendom. His first talk is entitled War and Revolution. I present Monsignor Sheen.
Friends, I wonder if you feel that it is getting a bit monotonous to start every new year with my series. There are some who believe that anyone who is full of life hates monotony. I trust that you do not share this view. Is it not rather true that anyone who is full of life enjoys repetition and finds a romance in it? A child is full of life. You put a child on your knee and bounce him up and down until your legs ache. The child will say, "Do it again." Tell the child an amusing story, and he will not say, "Oh, that's an old one. I heard Uncle Larry tell that last week." He will say, "Tell me again." Now, God is full of life, and therefore he loves repetition. And every morning he says to the sun, "Do it again." And every evening to the moon and stars, "Do it again." And every springtime to the daisies, "Do it again." And every time a child is born into the world, he asks for a curtain call and gives a divine encore, that the heart of a God may once more ring out in the heart of a babe. And now, as we turn the cycle of another year, and in your charity, you not only tune in to my message, but you breathe a prayer to God for me, may I say, do it again. This year it is my privilege to address you on the subject of the crises in Christendom. Naturally, it will concern itself with this awful cataclysm which has brought the world to the edge of the abyss. There are two ways of looking at this war. One as a journalist, and the other as a theologian. The journalist tells you what happens. The theologian tells you why it happens and what matters. If we look at this war through the eyes of a journalist or a commentator, it will be only a succession of events without any remote cause in the past and no great purpose in the future. But if we look at it through the eyes of God, then this war will not be meaningless. It may very well be a purposeful purging of the world's evil, that the world may have a rebirth of freedom under his law. For every human path leads on to God. He holds a myriad finer threads than gold, and strong as holy wishes, drawing us with delicate tension upwards to himself. In these broadcasts, we approach the war from the divine point of view because it is the only explanation which fits the facts. The great mass of American people are very frankly dissatisfied with the ephemeral and superficial commentaries on what is happening. Being endowed with intelligence, they want to know why it is happening. A recent poll revealed that 1/3 of the population of the United States did not know what this war was about. We all know what we are fighting against. We want to know what we are fighting for. We all know that we are in a war. We want to know what we must do to make a lasting peace. We know whom we hate. but we want to know what we ought to love. We know that we are fighting against a barbarism that is intrinsically wicked. We want to know what we must do to make the resurrection of that barbarism impossible. And to clear the ground, in this initial broadcast, we will first say what this war is not, and then what it is. First, this war is not merely a political and an economic struggle, but rather a theological one. It is not political and economic, because politics and economics are concerned only with the means of living. And it is not just the means of living that have gone wrong. It is the ends of living. Never before in the history of the world have we had so many abundant means of living. Never before was there so much power. Never before have men been so prepared to use that power for the destruction of human life. Never before have we had so much education. Never before so little coming to the knowledge of the truth. The basic reason why our politics and our economics have failed is because both have forgotten the end and purpose of life. We have been living as if civilization, culture, and peace were byproducts of economic activity, instead of the other way around. Politics and economics are as incapable of curing our ills as an alcohol rub is incapable of curing cancer. And if we think that they will, this world war will end in socialism. And socialism is only the obligatory and enforced organization of the means of living to prevent utter ruin. It is not our politics that has soured, nor our economics that has rusted. It is our hearts. We live and we act as if God had never made us. That is why I say this war is not political and economic in its fundamental aspects. It is theological. And secondly, this war has not been caused merely by evil dictators. It is commonly assumed that our milk of international peace is curdled because a few wicked dictators poured vinegar into it. Hence we think that if we could rid the world of these evil men, we could return to comparative prosperity and 2 chickens in every pot. What a delusion. These dictators are not the creators of the world's evil. They are its creatures. They are the boils on the surface of the world's skin. They come to the surface because there is bad blood underneath. It will do no good for us to lance the boils if we leave the source of the infection untouched. Have we forgotten that from 1914 to 1918, our cry was, "Rid the world of the Kaiser, and we will have peace"? Well, we got rid of the Kaiser, but we had no peace. We had another world war in 21 years. Now we are shouting, "Rid the world of Hitler and we will have peace." We will not. We must rid the world of Hitler, but we will not have peace unless we supply those spiritual and moral forces, the lack of which produced a Hitler. If we only knew it, there are 1,000 Hitlers in every land, hidden under the barbarism of our day. Peace does not come from the extermination of dictators, because dictators are only the effects of wrong philosophies of life. They are not the causes. They come into environments already prepared for them, like certain forms of fungi come into wet wood. Nazism is the disease of culture in its most virulent form, and could not have come to power unless the rest of the world were already sick. Were we honest, we would admit that we are all citizens of an apostate world, a world that has abandoned God. And for this apostasy, we are all responsible, but none more than we Christians, who are meant by God to be the salt of the earth, to prevent it from corruption. No, it is not the bad dictators who made the world bad. It is bad thinking. It is therefore in the realm of ideas that we will have to remake the world. And thirdly, this war is not just another war. When hostilities cease, we will not go back again to our former way of life. This war is not an interruption of the normal. It is the disintegration of the abnormal. We are very definitely at the end of an era of history. The old wells have run dry, and the staff of unlimited progress on which we leaned has pierced our hands. And we are now face to face with a fact which too many reactionaries still ignore, namely that society can become inhuman while preserving all the technical and material advantages of a so-called advanced civilization. We will not get back again to the same kind of world we had before this war began. And we do not want to. Anyone that would want to get back to the same kind of world would want to get back to a world that produced a Hitler. The world is pulling up its tents. Humanity is on the march. The old world is dead. And that brings us to what this war really is. There are two great events in the modern world: the war and the revolution. A war involves nations and alliances. A revolution involves ideas. A war moves on the horizontal plane of land and men. A revolution moves on the vertical plane of ideologies, doctrines, dogmas, and creeds and philosophies of life. This distinction is very important, for it explains how nations can be on one side of the war and on different sides of a revolution. Russia, for example, is on our side of the war, for which we are deeply grateful and whose courage and bravery we laud. But Russia is not yet on our side of the revolution. And please God, one day it may be. This war is only an episode in the revolution. Something incidental. It is the military phase by which the revolution is working itself out. The revolution is far more important than the war. For this world war is not a conflict of nations, as was the last world war, but a conflict of ideologies. And a far more important question than who will win the war is the question, who will win the revolution? In other words, what kind of ideologies or philosophies of life will dominate the world when this war is over? Now, a revolution, we said, involves ideologies, dogmas, and creeds. How many philosophies of life are involved in this revolution? It is generally assumed that there are only two. We hear it said that this war is a conflict between democracy and totalitarian systems, or that it is a conflict between Christian and an anti-Christian civilization. Would to God it were that simple. It would be very easy to understand. But it happens that there are actually three philosophies of life or ideologies involved. First, the totalitarian worldview. Secondly, the secularist or materialist view of the world in which you and I live. And thirdly, the Christian worldview. We will devote a number of broadcasts to each of these later on. We are presently concerned only in enumerating the three orders involved. We repeat, there is first the totalitarian worldview, which is anti-Christian, anti-democratic, anti-Semitic, anti-human. Secondly, there is the secularist or materialist worldview, which is humanistic and democratic, but which attempts to preserve these values on a non-moral and non-religious foundation. And thirdly, there is the Christian view, which grounds the human and democratic values of the Western world on a moral and religious basis. This Christian view includes not only the Christians, but also the Jews, who historically are the roots of the Christian tradition and who religiously are one with the Christian in the adoration of God, the acceptance of the moral law as the reflection of the eternal reason of God. Our choice, then, in this war is to be made among three dogmas. We have to decide whether man is a tool of the state, as the totalitarian believes, or whether man is an animal, as the secularist tradition of the Western world and too many Americans believe, or whether man is a creature made to the image and likeness of God, as the Christian believes. This is the essence of the conflict. And now, what are we going to do about it? We simply cannot go on as we have. A nation cannot live in war as it does in peace, nor can a church live in war as it does in peace. What are we Catholics doing as Catholics, which is any different to what we did in the days of peace? Do we realize that we are members of Christ's mystical body on earth, and as such, that we must repent for the world? No occasional prayer of victory, no fulfillment of the minimum of Christian duties, no sporadic religious exhibitionism fulfills either our obligation to our church or our obligation to America. We should know better than anyone else. As our Holy Father has told us, the whole world is seated in darkness because Christ has been re-crucified. Something must be done. Now what shall we do? Here is my request. It is a renewal of an appeal of last year, that you make a holy hour every single day, including in it the morning Mass. Start tomorrow morning. May every pastor in the United States note the difference. If you cannot go to Mass and communion, spend a holy hour in meditation and prayer in your own home. Pray for victory? Yes, we will win that. There is no doubt. But the peace, the restoration of the moral law, that will come only by a return to the mind and the spirit of the church during the first few centuries of persecution. Our bodies need not be in catacombs, but our minds must think and our minds must pray as if our bodies were there. And my friends among the Protestants and Jews, what are you doing now that is any different to the days you did in false peace? Are you saying more prayers? Are you more patiently making sacrifices in wartime, living as if God meant something in the dust of your common lives? May I ask you, too, to spend a holy hour every day in meditation and prayer, that the moral law of God may win over indifference and hatred of a world gone mad. And to all, whomsoever you be, who writes to us, I will gladly send you free of charge a prayer book for wartime entitled The Shield of Faith. Use it. These are darker days than we suspect. We have a double duty to do in this war. A double task, not a single one. We must defeat the active barbarism from without, and we must purge the passive barbarism from within. We must use our swords with an outward thrust against totalitarianism and its hard barbarism, and we must use a sword with an inward thrust to cut away our own soft barbarism. We have a war to win, and we have a revolution to win. War to win by overthrowing the power of the enemy in battle, and a peace to win by making ourselves worthy to dictate it. Victory on the field will conquer the hard barbarism, but repentance, catharsis of spirit alone will conquer the soft. If we merely defeat the hard barbarism and lose to the soft, we will be at the beginning of cyclic wars, which will return and return until we are beaten and broken and crushed in a creative despair of coming back again to God. This is the true revolution. All the other revolutions of the 20th century have been from without. This time we want a revolution from within. The revolutions which shook Europe during the last 25 years only shifted power from one class to another, and booty from one pocket to another, and authority from one political party to another. This time, we want a revolution that will change hearts. We want a revolution like the one pictured in the Magnificat of our Blessed Virgin Mary, which
was 1,000 times more revolutionary than the communistic manifesto of Karl Marx. The trouble with all political and economic revolutions of our times is that they are not revolutionary enough. They leave hate in the heart of a man.
The Right Reverend Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen of the Catholic University of America will now deliver the second in his series of 17 addresses on the crises in Christendom. His discourse today is entitled, "The Thing We Are Fighting Against." I present Monsignor Sheen.
Friends, last Sunday in our opening broadcast, we said 3 dogmas or philosophies of life are struggling for mastery in this war. The anti-Christian totalitarian worldview, the non-Christian secularist worldview of Western civilization, and the Christian worldview. Today we discuss the first, the anti-Christian totalitarian view. This anti-Christian, anti-human, anti-democratic totalitarian view exists in 4 forms, widely scattered throughout the world. First, in an historical form, as the revival of the imperial traditions of ancient Rome, which is fascism. Second, in an anthropological form, as the glorification of the Nordic race, which is Nazism. Third, in a theological form, as the identification of divinity with a dynastic house, which is Japanese imperialism. And fourth, in an economic form, as the proclamation of class struggle on the anti-religious basis of dictatorship of the proletariat, which is Marxian socialism. In the recent Christmas allocution, the Holy Father condemned these 4 forms in these words: as a conception which claims for particular nations or races or classes the norm from which there is no appeal. A short time ago, a graduate of one of the oldest and best-known secular universities in the East came to see me. He tried to argue me into his position, which was this: that there's no difference between the cause of America and the cause of the Nazis. He further contended that right and wrong were not involved in this war. For he said he had been taught in his particular university that there was no distinction between right and wrong. It was merely a question of a point of view. Now, this error I shall discuss in the next 2 broadcasts. Today I am concerned with giving you the arguments which I gave him. My position being that totalitarianism in all of its forms is intrinsically wicked, and for these 3 reasons. First of all, because it denies the value of a person by placing the value in the nation, the race, the class, and the dynasty. Second, because it denies the equality of all men. And thirdly, because it affirms that evil is the method and the goal of the revolution. First, it denies the value of a person. The basic principle of democracy is the sacredness of the individual as a creature endowed by God with inalienable rights. The basic principle of Nazism and the other totalitarian systems is that the individual has no rights except those given to him by the party or the state. In America, freedom resides in man. In Nazism, freedom resides in the race. In America, man endows the state with rights which he received from God. In Nazism and the other forms, the state endows man with rights which it got from the dictator. One of the very best expressions of this totalitarian idea that the individual has no value is to be found in the writings of that very influential German, Karl Marx, the founder of Marxian socialism, who in 1843 rejected the democratic conception of man on the grounds that it was Christian. These were his words: that each man has a value as a sovereign being is an illusion, a dream, and a postulate of Christianity which affirms that every man is a soul. And later on, writing in the first edition of Das Kapital, Marx further developed the same idea. He said, "If I speak of individuals, it is only insofar as they are personifications of economic categories and representatives of special class relations and interests." What does this mean in plain language? This means that Marx had no use for the individual worker or the individual proletariat as such. The person in himself has no value. He has value only as a member of a revolutionary class. And once the person ceases to be a member of that class, he ceases to have value. This disdain of the human person is the first dogma of all totalitarian systems. It explains, for example, why the Jew has no value and no rights under Nazism, because he's not a member of the revolutionary race. It explains fascism, which states society is the end, individuals only the means. It explains the wanton disregard of individual life by the Japanese imperial government and the statement of Japanese educators. The individual is not an entity, but depends upon the whole, arising from and kept in being by the state. These low and unspiritual views of man are the beginning of slavery, and it is to conquer them that America is at war. Secondly, totalitarianism in all of its forms is wrong because it denies the equality of all men. American democracy is founded on the principle of the essential spiritual equality of all men. When President Roosevelt was asked last October to whom his 4 freedoms were meant to apply, he answered, "To everyone, all over the world." Totalitarianism denies this basic equality. Under its system, men are equal only on condition that they belong to a certain class or race or dynasty or nation. Hitler therefore proclaims the superiority of the German race over all the peoples of the earth, with the possible exception of the Japanese. For Hitler has recently discovered that one of the Japanese sun gods is a first cousin of the German god Wotan. Isn't that wonderful? The persecution of the Jews arises, therefore, not because, as Hitler first claimed, that they were wealthy, but simply because they were not Nordic. According to the same basic principle, the Protestant pastor Niemöller and the Catholic bishops, such as Bishop von Gallen, are denied equality on the ground that they put loyalty to Christ above loyalty to the Führer. This idea of the absolute supremacy of the German race is found in a long line of German philosophers. Fichte, Hegel, Treitschke, and later on, this idea was set to music by Richard Wagner, who in his operas accustomed 3 generations of Germans to the myths of the Nordic and pagan past of Germany. Hitler says that Wagner is one of the inspirations of Nazism because of his glorification of Siegfried and the German myth. As a matter of fact, Wagner wrote that Germany already had one reincarnation of Siegfried in Frederick Barbarossa, who established the First Reich, Bismarck's being called the Second Reich. And Wagner said that a day would come when this Siegfried Barbarossa would have a third reincarnation in one whom he called, in his own words, a hero who turns against the ruin of his race, the hero wondrously divine. And he said that when this new Siegfried comes, he will make his home over the very spot where the bones of Siegfried and Frederick Barbarossa now lie supposedly buried in Berchtesgaden. It is to crush this idea that there is a superior race or a superior peoples that America is at war. And thirdly, totalitarianism is wicked because it makes evil the method and the goal of the revolution. Nazism is not negative like Marxian socialism. Marxian socialism is anti-religious. Nazism is very religious. But its religion is diabolical. There is only one way to describe how it grafted violence onto legality, and that is in the phrase of Rauschning, the revolution of nihilism. And such it is, the following of blind, irrational myths, the enthronement of the will to power. It is pointless for us to argue against the Nazis on the ground that they are cruel and unjust. We are not talking about the same things. What justice is to us, that injustice is to them. What we call virtue, they call vice. What we call kindness, they call cowardice. The inspiration for this idea is due principally to Friedrich Nietzsche, who sought to found another basis for morality than Christianity. Now, these were some of his principles. I am quoting him verbatim. Become hard. Morality must be shot. Man must be trained for war, and woman for the relaxation of the warrior. All else is folly. Purposeless evil is the most interesting kind of evil. It is not evil, it is goodness which has to be justified. Dionysius is sensuality and cruelty. Dionysius versus Christ. This is the contrast. Such is Nietzsche. And Hitler is the political and the military executor of Nietzsche's will. Now add all these three together. The denial of the value of the person, which the German Karl Marx proclaimed, the denial of the equality of all men, which the German philosophers proclaimed and which Wagner set to music, and then add to it the primacy of irrational power, lust, and cruelty, which the German Nietzsche affirmed, and you have the thing that we are fighting against. It is not a nation. It is not a state. It is a spirit, the spirit of Antichrist, the lost and awful perversion of a community that turned its back on God
and to whom Satan showed his face. And let no one stultify himself by believing that totalitarianism as we have defined it can be Christianized or democratized or humanized. For here we are not dealing with wicked men who could be converted through God's grace, but with a wicked ideology that makes conversion impossible. Erring sheep can be brought back into the sheepfold of Christ, but evil philosophies, which are like wolves, cannot. But this war is doing us a service. It is explaining, and better exploding the fallacy that it makes no difference what we believe. It does. It makes a tremendous amount of difference what we believe, for we act on our beliefs. If our beliefs are right, our deeds will be right. The evil of the Nazis is that they practice what they preach. Because their philosophy is wrong, their deeds are wicked. But you ask, how could Nazism become so popular? Why should totalitarianism sweep over most of Europe within 20 years? The answer is not difficult to find. And then the answer is a lesson for us. These demonic forces replace the spiritual anarchy of a bourgeois civilization with a semblance of order. They found substitutes for the doubt and the skepticism and the sophistication of irresponsible intelligentsia in the certitude of an absolute authority embodied in a social philosophy. They prove to us that any worldview is better than no view. That a regime that possesses some authority is better than a regime which has none. They supplied some kind of an answer, false though it was, to the hidden dominance of the lords of finance, to the indifference of democracies to absolute values, and to the claim of great merchants that private gain has precedence over the common good. They appealed to people because they arose in part as a reaction against the excesses and defects of the materialist culture of our Western world, which we will begin to explain incidentally next Sunday. They corrected abuses after the fashion of a man who might burn down his barn to get rid of the rats. But they are the logical conclusion, and let us not mistake it, the logical conclusion of the last 200 years with its progressive repudiation of Christian principles in social, political, and economic life. Which repudiation produced first a non-religious civilization, our own. Then an anti-religious civilization, Marxian socialism. And finally, the new false religion of Nazism against which we are fighting now. We are at war against a devil. There is a devil. Man is no match for him. And unless we quickly get on God's side and trust in God's strength, we will lack the faith to see the devil and then the moral indignation to oppose him. And that is why I am appealing in every broadcast to every American to return to God, to spend an hour a day in prayer and meditation. Jews and Protestants can make this hour in their homes, but Catholics should make it in church, since our divine Lord is present in the tabernacle. And this hour should, if possible, include morning mass and communion, which would entail both prayer and fasting. And anyone who would like a prayer book for wartime, entitled The Shield of Faith, to assist in making this hour, we will gladly send it free for the asking. But America must awake. There is too great a disparity between the effort on the battlefront and the effort on the home front. Our American boys that are cutting away the underbrush at Guadalcanal,
fighting sharks on rafts in the Pacific, rushing Jap pillboxes in New Guinea, and attacking through mud one season and heat another in Africa, have a right to ask a commensurate sacrifice of those who are at home. If we were fighting a nation, we could leave the job to the armed forces, but we are fighting an evil, something intrinsically wicked. We are in combat with a demon, and the kind of a demon that our divine Lord said is driven out only by prayer and fasting. Eddie Rickenbacker made his holy hour of prayer on a raft in the Pacific. And any one of us who thinks it is too much to make it in his home or in church is not worthy to salute the same flag. This is not a war. This is a revolution against the anarchic spirit of evil. And our supreme business is to drive the demons back again to hell. But they will not obey that command, either while we stand or while we sit. They will obey it only when we are on our knees, praying and fasting and watching an hour. God love you.
The Right Reverend Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen of the Catholic University of America will now deliver the third in his series of 17 addresses on the crises in Christendom. His discourse today is entitled, Some Barnacles on the Ship of Democracy. I present Monsignor Sheen.
Friends, last Sunday we spoke of the first of the three philosophies of life involved in this war, the totalitarian. Today and next Sunday, we speak of the second, the secularist and materialist culture of the Western world. By the secularist ideology, we mean the attempt to preserve human and democratic values on a non-moral and non-religious foundation. The condemnation of secularism of the Western world is not a condemnation of the Western world. There is the same distinction to be made between the two as between a ship and its barnacles. The ship in its passage through the seas picks up barnacles which impede its free progress through the waters. Every now and then, that ship must be brought into dry dock to have the barnacles scraped away. The ship is good. The barnacles are bad. Now, Western civilization, or what we call democracy, may be likened to a ship. America, in particular, is a good ship. It carries the precious cargo of belief in inalienable rights and liberties. This ship of America is good. It carries the burden of the four freedoms of which our president spoke. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. This ship of America is good, and it is freighted down with the cargo of the right of sanctuary. For America has been a sanctuary in the past, and is a sanctuary now to the oppressed peoples of the world, as no other land on the face of God's earth has been a sanctuary. This ship of America is good, and it is freighted down with the precious cargo of all those fine and noble things
which make you and me proud to call ourselves Americans.
But in the course of sailing, this ship has acquired some barnacles. And these barnacles, or superstitions, of which I shall speak, constitute what we call the passive or soft barbarism from within. And they are a danger to Western civilization, not quite as open as totalitarianism, but just as insidious. Today we shall describe 3 of these barnacles: the superstition of progress, of scientism, and materialism. After we have described them, we hope that we will be able to scrape them off. First, the barnacle or the superstition of progress. It runs some such way as this: man is naturally good and indefinitely perfectible. By the mere fact that he lives, and thanks to great cosmic floods of evolution, he will be swept onward and onward until he becomes a kind of a god, and this earth becomes a paradise. Goodness increases with time, while evil and error decline. Progress is automatic. Such is the superstition of progress. Now, why is it wrong? It is wrong because it confuses mechanical advancement with moral betterment. Progress in things is not necessarily progress in persons. Planes may go faster, but man does not necessarily become happier. Mastery over disease is not necessarily mastery over sin. Conquest of nature does not mean conquest of selfishness. Time does not always operate in favor of betterment. Because a man is sick, time does not make him better. Unless the evil is corrected, time may operate in favor of disease, decay, and death. True progress is morally and not mechanically conditioned. It depends not on vitamins, more playgrounds and better milk and ductless glands, but on the will to goodness. There is therefore only one real, true progress in the world, and that consists in the diminution of the traces of original sin. History does not prove that we are making progress. Notice the intervals between wars in modern times. The interval between the Napoleonic Wars and the Franco-Prussian War was 55 years. The interval between the Franco-Prussian War and the First World War was 43. The interval between the First World War and this one, 21, 55, 43, 21, and each war more destructive than the other, and at a time when man had all the material conditions essential for happiness. Is this real progress? The sad and tragic fact is that modern man, under sufficient stress, and even among comforts, will do deeds of evil as terrible as any that have ever been recorded in human history. Barbarism is not behind us. Barbarism is beneath us. And at any moment, it can emerge unless our wills, aided by God's grace, repress it. Our own mechanical ability to move quickly can go hand in hand with the power to do more evil. Let no one deny it. Our scientific progress has outstripped our moral progress. The myth of necessary progress has exploded. But because the evil in the world does not evolve right, does not mean, as they say, that there is no right. What it does mean is that we must put it right. And in order to do this, we may have to learn the lesson of the cross and the agony of Gethsemane. Maybe we had all better get back again to God. Then there is the second barnacle, or superstition, the superstition of scientism. I do not say science, I say scientism. And by scientism I mean that particular abuse of science which affirms that the scientific method is the only way of knowing anything. It is this particular superstition which makes people say, science tells us. But they never say, scriptures tell us, or the church tells us, or the commandments tell us. Science is supposed to be the very last word on any subject. Hence there's no place for values, tradition, metaphysics, revelation, faith, authority, or theology. The only true knowledge is that which comes from counting. Such is the superstition of scientism which has gripped America. Now, science is, of course, a very valid way of knowing, but only of knowing those things which are subject to experimentation and the methods of the laboratory. The great values of life, such as justice and truth and charity, are beyond experimentation. No one has yet ever been able to put a mother's love into a test tube. But who will deny that it exists? We cannot put a man into a cauldron and boil him and stew him until he gives forth the unmistakable green fumes of envy. The great values of life are beyond the laboratory. And scientism of this kind is ruining higher education in the United States. It is doing it by assuming that anyone who has counted something that has never been counted before is a learned man. It makes no difference what you count in higher education. But in the name of heaven, count. A certain Western university awarded a Doctor of Philosophy degree to a student who wrote on the thesis the microbic content of cotton undershirts. A Midwestern university has counted the ways of washing dishes. Eastern universities have counted the infinitives in Augustine, the datives and the ablatives in Ovid, the 4 ways of cooking ham, and another, to quote their own words, the psychological reactions of the post-rotational eye movement of squabs. Go into any Catholic school in the United States tomorrow and take out any child in the 1st or 2nd grade and say to that child, why are you here? Where are you going? What is the purpose of life? And the child will be able to answer your questions. But ask this PhD student who counted the microbes and cotton undershirts why he's here, where he's going, what is his destiny. He would not be able to tell you. He would not have a 5-cent gadget in his house 5 minutes without knowing its goal or its purpose, and yet he will live 10, 20, 60 years without knowing why he is here or where he is going. It is not true that modern youth is revolutionary because he lacks sufficient economic advantages. Never before has modern youth had so many.
The modern youth is revolutionary because he has no purpose in life. And unless, as a nation, we restore purposes and values in education, we will end only by educating for chaos. Oh, we are paying a terrible penalty for divorcing our science from God. Nature, which studies science, belongs to God. When man turns against God, nature or science turns against man, as Francis Thompson rather beautifully put it. I tempted all ye servitors, but to find my own betrayal in their constancy. In faith to him, in fickleness to me, their traitorous trueness and their loyal deceit. That is the true story. Nature will be false to anyone who is untrue to its maker. For years, science has been discovering the wonders of nature, but instead of glorifying God, has forgotten God. And scientists thought themselves the authors of the book of nature instead of only its proofreaders. And tearing nature away from God, nature now turns against them. And the result, that science, which was supposed to be our servant, is now our master. Why is it that millions today shrink in terror from a machine in the air? Why does man use his technique to destroy man? Why do children crouch in dread and mothers dig holes in the bowels of the earth as bombs fall from the skies and all hell is let loose? If it is not because science has gotten beyond our control. Maybe we had all better get back again to God. And the third barnacle or superstition is materialism. This superstition affirms that man has no soul, there is no future life, man is only an animal. As our modern psychologists tell us, he is a psychoanalytical bag filled with physiological libido, or he is a stimulus response mechanism, the end of whose life is the acquisition of money, the enjoyment of pleasure. There are no standards outside of the material. Now, it simply is not true that peace follows material prosperity. There is more frustration among the rich than among the poor. Sin and evil do not disappear with the advent of prosperity. Society can become inhuman while preserving all the advantages of a material prosperity. And if there are no standards outside of the material, how shall we judge the new acquisitive society which is arising based on the acquisitiveness of power as against the old acquisitiveness of money? As fortunes dwindle, as taxes eat up inheritances, and as bureaucracies begin to administer vast sums of money formerly administered by capitalists and bankers, envious, greedy, and lustful men will seek to become dispensers of that social booty. And who shall say that these new financiers of power are wrong? Given no other standard than that of materialism, wherein power is disjoined from conscience, and we lose the right to protest in the name of justice. Our world is sick of materialism. It is pathetic to hear people ask, what can I as an individual do in this crisis? These people who have been told that they are only animals, many of them feel like cogs and machines. They want to get away from it all. Some of them would like to climb back into catacombs. Like Jews in exile, they hang their harps on the trees
and ask how they can sing a song in a foreign land without a soul. There will be a change. The millions of boys on the battlefronts of the world who are fighting for their lives and for great moral issues will recover their souls. Amidst wounds and death and fire and shell, they will get close to the meaning of life and to that something within them which really makes them human. And then they will look back, and they will be angry at those who educated them. They will come to hate not only the enemy in battle, but they will hate still more the intelligentsia at home who told them that they were only animals. They will begin to realize that these so-called educators rob them of their greatest possession, faith. And for a while, they will wander around the battlefields like Mary Magdalene in the garden, saying, "They have taken away my Lord, and I know not where they laid him." But when they do stumble on him, as Magdalene did when she saw the red, livid marks of nails, they will enter once again into the possession of the soul. And when they come marching home, there will be a judgment on those intelligentsia who told them that they had no soul. They will begin to live like new men. There will be a rebirth of freedom under God. For maybe, and only are they right, maybe we had all better be right and get back again to God. Why do I speak about these barnacles on the ship of democracy? Because they are endangering the American way of life. Because they are outmoded ways of thinking. Because we are called upon in this world war to be the moral leaders of the world. Never before was a greater task thrust into any nation's hands than into our own. We have a great vocation, and we must be worthy of it. And we do not want the ship of America to be held up in its mission by barnacles and false superstitions. And may I therefore ask you, Jews, Protestants and Catholics, to spend an hour a day in prayer, that America may be worthy of its calling. Catholics should include daily Mass and communion in this hour. And to anyone who wishes a prayer book for wartime, entitled A Shield of Faith, we will send it with our compliments. For how else except by prayer? Realize the pledge of our president when he said, "The United Nations seek to work for the restoration of the international order in which Christ guides the hearts of individuals and nations." That is a tremendous responsibility. America, awake! You have a high summons. Walk worthy of your vocation. Purge yourself. Repent. Your greatness is in your return to God. God love you.
The Right Reverend Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen of the Catholic University of America will now deliver the fourth in his series of 17 addresses on the crises in Christendom. His discourse today is entitled, "More Barnacles on the Ship of Democracy." I present Monsignor Sheen.
Friends, next Sunday we will begin treating the third philosophy of life involved in this war, the Christian. Today we conclude the second, the materialist culture of the Western world. The great ship of America, we said last Sunday, has developed a few barnacles which endanger our democracy and the stability of our national life. We mention now three more of these barnacles.
First, license. Secondly, the Trojan horse. And thirdly, relativism. First, the barnacle or the superstition of license. We hear it asserted in some such way as this: freedom means the right to do whatever you please, and is to be understood as the absence of law, restraint, and discipline. A man is said to be free when his desires are satisfied. He is said not to be free when they are unsatisfied. The goal of freedom is self-expression. Such is the superstition of license, or perverted freedom. Now, this superstition is grounded on a very false definition of freedom. Freedom does not mean the right to do whatever you please. If it did, it would be a physical power and not a moral power. Certainly we can do whatever we please, but ought we? Freedom means the right to do whatever we ought, and therefore is inseparable from law. Nor is it true, as our moderns say, that freedom consists in the shaking off of convention, tradition, and authority. What is called self-expression is in reality often nothing else than self-destruction. About the only curb the modern sensate man allows himself are those curbs which contribute to his health. He diets, but he never fasts. He feels justified in throwing off all restraints for no other reason than because they are old. When we reach a point where we judge our freedom by the height of the pile of discarded inhibitions, such as the commandments of God, then anyone who would die for that disemboweled ghost of freedom is a fool. Furthermore, the superstition of license assumes that men will always do the right thing if they are educated. Hence the contempt for discipline. Now here we touch on the basic weakness of modern education. It assumes that sin is ignorance and is not due to the abuse of freedom. Evil is attributed to want of enlightenment. When confronted with the problem of evil, educators immediately rush to a conference to discuss means of diffusing greater knowledge, when what is really needed is a little more discipline. The intellect makes mistakes, but the will sins. And education must return to the forgotten truth that character is in the will, not in the reason. A man may know all we have to teach him and still be a bad man. The ignorant are not necessarily devils, nor are the intelligentsia necessarily saints. The fact is that when education becomes the servant of a perverse will, it can increase man's capacity for wickedness. Unless then education restores discipline, restraint, and trains the conscience of the young, our license will end in anarchy. Why should it take a war to bring out the heroic in us? Why does no one think of the necessity of discipline and restraint until we set out on the business of killing? And if the bravest die in battle, when shall come courage in peace? There is only one solution. We must begin in America to think less of the things we want to be free from and begin to think more of the things we want to be free for. And that is why I appeal to the Jews and the Protestants and the Catholics in this radio audience to make a holy hour of meditation and prayer every day in order that they may come to an understanding of why God made them. And we will send with our compliments a copy of a prayer book entitled The Shield of Faith to whomsoever writes for it.
And we want Catholics to make this holy hour by including Mass and communion every morning. Is it asking too much to make a daily holy hour? I just received word from a sailor whose ship was sunk in the Solomon Islands. Everything he had went down with the ship. Everything except a water-soaked, tattered, and well-thumbed little book entitled The Holy Hour, which we gave away last year on the Catholic Hour. For 22 days and nights, with their awful agony of hunger and thirst, this boy and his companions, floating about the watery wastes of the Pacific on a rubber raft, made many holy hours from that little red book, and God heard their prayer and brought them to safety, and he sent me this news. I wonder which of my listeners would dare tell any one of these brave boys that they found a daily holy hour a little too hard. And that brings us now to our second barnacle, or superstition, the barnacle of the Trojan horse. There is one great menace to our country and to the world which we may not ignore, and that is Marxian socialism or communism. It is rather soft-pedaled in these days because of our alliance with Russia, but for no good reason. Because Russia is on our side, Russia never feels impelled to go into ecstasies about the glories of democracy, and neither do I see any reason why, because we are on the side of Russia, we should go into ecstasies about Marxian socialism. What is making Russia great in this conflict is not its atheistic communism. It is its love of the fatherland, its fondness for its earth, its natural asceticism and self-sacrifice, its deep and righteous hatred of the invader. These great qualities of the Russian soul make us hope that Russia will once more re-enter the comity of nations of the Western world, the roots of which are Christian, and that Russia one day will accept the four freedoms, one of which is freedom of religion. We are speaking here of Marxian socialism, and now with particular reference to our own country. What we have to fear in this country is the new Trojan horse. The old Trojan horse, you remember, looked like democracy on the outside. But on the inside, it was the suppression of private property, religion, and personal rights. The new Trojan horse on the outside looks like a united war effort. But on the inside, it is the same old anti-Americanism. In other words, under the guise of our military kinship with Russia, Marxian socialism is undermining our American government and way of life. And so skillfully is it done that it is made to appear that anyone who says a word against communism is sabotaging our war effort. This is nonsense. The two things are quite distinct, and let no one doubt it. Stalin himself said that he was fighting against Nazism, but not against Germany. That gives us the right to say that we are against communism, but not against Russia. Now let us get the record straight. We want Russia to drive the Nazis out of their land. We want their people to live in peace with themselves and with the world. But we do not want communism in America or Germany
or Poland any more than we want Nazism or fascism. And if anyone doubts the sincerity of our love for Russia, let me say that every Catholic priest in the world daily says prayers to our divine Lord, the Blessed Mother, and the Apostles for the intention of Russia. And that is more than the communists do. In other words, we American Catholics are for the Russian bear, but we are not for the Trojan horse. We want the Russian bear to eat the Nazi swastika, but we do not want the Trojan horse to eat the American eagle. And that brings us to our third barnacle, or superstition. This one is very common. You've heard it in some such way as this. There's no distinction between truth and error, right and wrong. Everything depends upon your point of view. All values are relative. When expedient, moral conventions can be accepted. When a hindrance, they can be rejected. There are no moral objective standards, and hence no absolute distinction between good and evil. Everyone is his own lawgiver. Everyone is his own judge. Such is the superstition of relativism. Now, this idea that there's no absolute distinction between right and wrong, truth and error, stems in this country from the philosophy of pragmatism. This philosophy denies that God is an absolute. It judges truth not by its consistency or by its correspondence with reality, but by its utility. As one of the very best known of all American philosophers has written, and I am quoting him verbatim, the true is only the expedient in our way of thinking. The right is only the expedient in our way of behaving. Expedient in almost any fashion. Such is his idea. In other words, whatever succeeds is right. And this philosophy is taught in every secular college and university in the entire United States without exception. Now, what are its consequences? Well, for the last 2 or 3 decades, thousands of Japs have been studying in the United States in our great universities, and they heard these pragmatic ideas, and they used to write these ideas down in their textbooks. And when a professor said, there's no such thing as right and wrong, the true is the expedient in your way of thinking, and the right and the good, the expedient in your way of behaving, the Japs wrote it faithfully. They closed their copybooks, and they took them back to Japan. And when they got back to Japan, they opened their notebooks, and they read again about the right being the expedient. They studied their lesson well, and their little weazened eyes became more weazened as they read. And finally, when they were sure they had learned their lesson, they closed their notebooks, and they flew across waters, and on December the 7th, they bombed Pearl Harbor. Were they right? Were they? Did not our fascist intelligentsia tell them they were right? Did not they say that anything that is expedient is right? Well, it was expedient, was it not? Thus did our superstition come home to roost on a bombed and exploded American soil.
Oh, how blind we are. Can we not see that in abandoning the moral basis of life, we abandon the right to call anyone wrong? What moral standards are the Japs violating if the criterion of truth and righteousness is expediency? Why do we say that the Japs have violated the conscience of the world if the conscience of the world has no other standard than useful? And incidentally, where was this moral conscience of the world before the war began? How shall the righteousness of our cause be distinguished from the righteousness of our enemy's cause if there is no objective standard outside of both? If there is no objective distinction between right and wrong, how in the name of heaven can Hitler be wrong? And how can we be right? Maybe as a nation, we had better get back again to God. Our greatest enemy in the United States is the intelligentsia who teach these ideas. Now, what do I mean by the intelligentsia? By the intelligentsia, I mean those who have been educated beyond their intelligence and who destroy morals and wreck morale. Thank heavens our boys in the battlefronts of the world do not share the views of these educators and journalists and writers who have been sniping away for years at the moral law, calling it reactionary, behind the times, labeling purity and truthfulness as bourgeois virtues, as Karl Marx does. Our boys on the battlefronts do not believe these things. They believe in an absolute distinction between right and wrong. When Colin Kelly, for example, as a selfless pilot, sank the first Jap ship of this war, and in doing so lost his life. When Edwin O'Hare shot down the first Jap plane. When Dick Fleming made himself the first human torpedo. When Daniel Callahan became the first admiral to go down fighting. When Mike Moran became the first naval officer to sink 6 Jap ships in a single combat. When Commander John Shea became the first fighting man whose last letter to his son became a famous American testament on patriotism. When the 5 Sullivans became the first American family of boys to be snuffed out in this war. These men had no opinion about America's cause. They did not believe that the righteousness of the Stars and Stripes depended upon our subjective outlook. They believed in an absolute distinction between right and wrong, between our cause and the cause of our enemies. In fact, so much so did they believe it that they were willing to make their own lives secondary to our cause. And while these and millions of other boys in our armed forces believe in that distinction, an absolute distinction between right and wrong, we have these intelligentsia at home in our classrooms saying to our young, there's no distinction between right and wrong. It all depends upon your point of view. Everything is relative. Friends, this is nonsense. It does not depend upon our point of view. Our cause is right. It is right before God. It is right under God.
and in God's name, we will defend it.
God love you.
The Right Reverend Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen of the Catholic University of America will now deliver the fifth in his series of 17 addresses on the crises in Christendom. His discourse today is entitled, The Christian Order. I present Monsignor Sheen.
Friends, today we come to a more pleasant task, the constructive part of our series. In order to reach it, it was necessary to point out the evils and defects of those systems which either deny or forget Almighty God and the moral law. It was only after John the Baptist laid the axe to the roots of evil trees that our Lord sowed the seed of the tree of life. Christianity preaches its good news only after one has heard the bad news. Today we begin the good news of the Christian order. The Christian worldview differs from the totalitarian view and from the materialist culture view of the Western world in one basic fact. It believes that it is man who makes society, and not society which makes man. That is why our first broadcast on the Christian order must begin with man. After all, what is the use of a revolution, or a new economic order, or a new international society, unless we know the type of person for whom it is intended? If an architect were asked to design a building, he would want to know who was going to live in it. If the sick were to live in it, he would build a hospital. If the criminals were to live in it, he would build a penitentiary. In like manner, before we draw up plans for a new social order, we should ask the question, who is going to live in it? This is very important, because for the last century, there have been many distorted views of human nature. There were fashions in man as there were fashions in clothes. Some fashions concentrating on one particular aspect to the neglect of all others, very much like the blind men who felt an elephant, each describing it differently accordingly as he touched the trunk, the tail, the ear, or the legs. For example, some blind men in the days of Darwin felt man. And since he felt like an animal, they said he must be an animal, and therefore should be treated as one. Such was the Darwinian man. And then there came a new fashion. Blind men felt man again, and they found that he was made up of nerves and reflexes and responses and ganglia, and so we had the Freudian or psychological man who consulted dream books after each fitful sleep to learn what Freud had to say about his sex life. And then there came a blind philosopher who made the great discovery that man spent a great deal of his time earning a living. Universalizing this particular aspect, he gave us the economic man, or the Marxian man, for whom religion and law and culture and the arts were byproducts of economic methods of production. Now we are at the beginning of a new fashion in man. Blind men discovered that man lived in a state, that he was dependent on it for his ideas. And thus was born the political man whom the new lawyers tell us has no rights except those which have been given to him by the state. Now these partial views of man, of Marx, of Spencer, of Darwin, and of Freud, never treat man as he really is. They are incidental activities erected into absolutes. The thinking of these men is very much of the same mental caliber as one who thinks, for example, a manicurist,
who might think that a man was all hands, or a dentist who might think that a man was all teeth. The Christian view of man admits that man has ganglia, that he dreams, that he experiences libidos, that he works, and that he talks politics. But it insists that man is none of these things exclusively. He's not even all of these things added together, any more than a baby is the sum of chemicals in the laboratory. The Christian begins by asking this question: what is it that makes a man different from anything else in all the world? And it answers, an intellect and a will. An intellect by which man can know truth, and a will by which he can choose goodness. And next, Christianity says, since man is different from an animal because of an intellect and a will, he must have a different purpose than an animal, just as a monkey wrench must have an entirely different purpose than a monkey. Now, this purpose will obviously be in keeping with what is highest in his life, namely his intellect and his will. Man, therefore, will never be completely satisfied until he attains three things. First, he wants life. Not life for 2 more months or 2 more years, but abiding eternal life. And secondly, he wants truth for his intellect. Not the truths of geography to the exclusion of science, nor of history to the exclusion of anything else, but all truth, without any admixture of error. And thirdly, he wants love. Not love for any definite period of time, but an eternal ecstasy of love without shadow of hate or satiety. Now, this eternal life and truth and love which man seeks is God. God, therefore, is his final and his ultimate end. Hence, politics, governments, economics, social security are not the ends of human life. They are only the means to the final end, which is God, and they therefore derive their morality from that final end. This is the Christian view of man. Now, Christianity also explains the inner conflicts of man. There is not a single one of us who does not feel as if we were two. There's something good in us, and there is something bad in us. We have higher ideals than we realize. We sink to lower depths than we wish. Our souls are like radios tuned into 2 different stations, the one heaven and the other hell, and all that we seem to get is static and just a meaningless jumble. As St. Paul tells us, the good which we will to do, that we do not. And the evil which we will not, that we do. How often we say, what a fool I have been. And yet, how wise we have to be to know that we are fools. Why is it we are this way? If it be not because something has happened to us, something to destroy our original unity, namely sin. Man has contradicted himself in contradicting God. Thus, our primitive freedom, which was meant to be free for God and in God, has become perverted to mean in modern man freedom from God. We are godless now, but we would never be godless without God. That is why we are the way we are.
because of sin. But Christianity does not leave man in his sin. Because the image of God was defaced, the divine original came to this earth to remake that image. And that was our divine Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And being man, he could act as man and for man. Being God, his redemption would be of infinite value. He allowed all of our sins to come to a head and to do their worst against him, namely to put him to death. But in attempting to kill God, which is the nature of sin, sin wrote its own condemnation. For by rising from the dead by the power of God, he made the disaster of sin the beginning of a new and regenerated humanity under his leadership, which is the kingdom of God. There is absolutely, however, no compulsion about his appeal. He does not force a single one of us who are fallen and disordered to live according to his level. Any one of us may continue to live on this subhuman level that we are. He has left us free. Feet that are pierced with nails cannot run down an unwilling prey. His very flag is the flag of freedom, a king on a cross. For how can he enslave or dictate who has no arms to fight except love and a broken heart? Just think how different our political and economic system would be if it were based on this Christian concept of man. Incidentally, we will begin to explain next Sunday the repercussions of this Christian doctrine of man on the economic and social order. But presently we are concerned with this problem. What chance is there today in this world of restoring the Christian concept of man? When one thinks, on the one hand, of how few there are who really acknowledge God, how few practical Christians there are for whom Christ is the way and the truth and the life, and on the other hand, when we think of the terrific power of evil to mold the minds of men and their touchiness about worldly alliances, along with their callousness for the preservation of the moral law, I say, when we think of these things, the task seems hopeless. And hopeless it would be if the strength of our cause came from power or numbers or influence and not from the Spirit of God. Given this Spirit, a Christian will never lose courage. For although a pagan will have courage as long as there is a chance for victory, the Christian must have courage when there is absolutely no chance. For his victory comes not from his fight, but from his faith. This is the victory that overcometh the world, your faith. Will this broadcast help to restore that Christian concept of man? Not a bit. I have no illusions about it. That is why in each broadcast I ask the Jews and the Protestants to set aside a holy hour a day for prayer and meditation. That is why I ask every Catholic to include in this holy hour daily Mass and communion. And anyone who desires a prayer book entitled The Shield of Faith to assist in this hour, we will gladly send it free. I am not giving these broadcasts, you know, in order that you might listen to me. I am using these broadcasts as an excuse for prayer and for the holy hour. Holy hour is not incidental to the broadcast. It is the broadcasts that are incidental to the holy hour. And if one of the reasons you have no time to spend an hour a day in communion with God during this war is because you are listening to this program of mine, then for heaven's sake, shut it off. And get down on your knees. You will do more good for your soul and your mind and America and the world than you will by listening to this broadcast. Granted now your prayers. What objection is there to this suggestion of ours that we build a new order based on the Christian concept of man? There is only one objection. We hear it on all sides. Christianity does not suit the modern man. Certainly it does not. We never contended that it did. And the reason it does not is because the modern man is not man. He is a part man, a dissected man. But Christianity does suit man in his entirety as a creature composed of body and soul. Up until now, it has been said, Christianity does not suit the modern man. Therefore, let us scrap Christianity. Do you not think that it is about time for us to turn it around? And to put it this way, Christianity does not suit the modern man. Therefore, let us scrap the modern man. There is a possibility worth considering. Maybe there's nothing wrong with Christianity after all. May we dare suggest it? Maybe there is something wrong with us. Maybe there is something wrong with the flippancy of George Bernard Shaw and nothing wrong with the theology of St. John. Maybe there is something askew with H.G. Wells and nothing wrong with St. Vincent de Paul. Maybe there is something wrong with progressive education. And maybe there's nothing wrong with the light of the world. After all, how can we have peace and justice unless we love one another? Take this key sentence, which certainly conditions peace. Therefore, let us love one another. Put it at the end of the Darwinian man. Man is descended from a monkey. Therefore, let us love one another. Ridiculous, isn't it? Put it at the end of the Marxian man. Man is a tool-making animal. Therefore, let us love one another. Foolish. Put it at the end of the Freudian man. Man is a cosmic ganglion. Therefore, let us love one another. That is more foolish still. Now, put it at the end of the Christian man. Man is a creature made to the image and likeness of the God of love. Therefore, let us love one another. That makes sense, doesn't it? And that is where we will have to begin in rebuilding a new world. And all of our planning, regardless of how profound it is, will end nowhere except in socialism unless we return to this Christian concept of man. We have given the Marxists their chance. We have given the Darwinians theirs. We have given the Freudians theirs. And we have given the liberals theirs. Now, let us give man a chance. God love you. The Christian solution is to get behind neither capital or labor exclusively, but to be behind capital when Marxian socialism would destroy private property,
and to be behind labor when monopolistic capitalism would claim the priority of profits over the rights of a just wage. If we are behind either capital or labor, at what point will either of them stop in their demands? Or is there a stopping point? Did capital ever decide for itself when it was in the saddle that it would take no more than 10% profits? The fact is, capital took all the profits the traffic would bear. And now that capital is unseated and labor is riding the economic horse, what limits does labor set itself? Is there a wage beyond which it will not ask? Are there certain minimum hours below which it will not seek to work? They, too, are trying to get all the traffic will bear. When self-interest and class interest become the standard, then who shall say which is right and wrong? As the old Chinese proverb put it, no good rat will injure the grain near its hole. And this brings us to a consideration of the economic and political principle of the Christian order. The Christian order starts with man. All other orders start with class. Capitalism and communism, for example, though they are opposite in their directions, like branches of a tree, are nevertheless rooted in the same economic principle, namely that class takes all. Communism is really only rotted capitalism. Under capitalism, the employer takes all. Under Marxian socialism, the employee takes all. But the Christian economic order, as we said, starts with man. Incidentally, next Sunday we will show the repercussions of this doctrine on the family. Now, the basic principle of the Christian order is this: economic activity is not the end of human life, but the servant of human life. Therefore, the true primary end of economic production is not profit, but the satisfaction of human needs. In other words, Christianity says production exists primarily for consumption and only secondarily for profits. Christianity demands a revolutionary change of the economic order because it affirms the primacy of the human over the economic. Its starting principle is that the right of a man to a living wage is prior to the right of a return on investments. Now, from this basic principle of the Christian economic order, 7 conclusions follow, and they constitute the Christian charter on economics. First, when an industry is unable to pay a wage sufficient not only for a moderately comfortable life, but also for savings, the difference should be made up either by industry pooling a percentage of all wages paid, or in default of this, by the state. Second, neither the capitalist's right to profit nor the laborer's right to organization are absolute and unlimited. They are both subject to the common good, and both can be suspended for the common good. Both the right to profits and the right to organization are only means. And as means, they are to be judged by the way they promote the true ends of life, namely religion, general prosperity, peace, and happy human relations. Third, the consumer must not be treated as the indispensable condition of unlimited demands by labor or unlimited profits by capital, but as the person whose interest is the true end of the whole economic process. Fourth, the distinction between capital and labor, which has its basis presently in whether one buys or sells it, must be broken down. And it must give way to a union of capital and labor on the basis of a common service which both of them render to the nation. To ask which is more important, capital or labor, is like asking which is the more important to a man, the right leg or the left. Since both of them have a common function, they should function together. Fifth, the wage contract should, whenever possible, be modified by a contract of partnership between employer and employee, so that wage earners are made sharers in some way in the profits or management or ownership of industry. Since both produce social wealth, there is no reason why both should not share in the wealth which is produced. A worker in a factory has more rights to the profits of industry than a man who merely clips coupons. The only way to make labor responsible is to give it some capital to defend. And the only way to make capital responsible is to make it labor for the right of possession. Did you ever hear of an artist agitating for a 5-hour day? Why not? Because his work is his life. Today men do not work. They only have employment. There is a difference between work and employment. Work is a divine vocation. Employment is an economic necessity. A laborer will sit on someone else's tools, but no artist will sit down on his own paintbrushes. The reason is the artist's work entails responsibility. That is why those who are getting behind either capitalists to defend them against labor racketeers, or behind labor to defend them against economic royalists, are delaying the day of economic peace and contributing to the present economic conflict. The Christian solution is to unite them both on the basis of a common task. And sixth, democracy should be extended and not curtailed. For many decades, political power was controlled to a great extent by organized capital, by merchants and lords of finance, and by industrialists. Today, the stage is being prepared for the control of political power by labor. A class transmission of power by either capital or labor is opposed to the basic principle of democracy. The Christian concept of politics is that government exists for the common good of all. If democracy is to be made effective, the holders of economic power, whomsoever they be, whether they be capital or labor, must be made responsible to the community. They are its servants, not its masters. And seventh, and finally, since the best of economic plans will fail unless selfishness is eradicated, and since this is impossible without religion, we ask the Jews and the Protestants and the Catholics to prepare for a new economic order by spending a holy hour a day in prayer and meditation. The Catholics, including in this holy hour daily Mass and Holy Communion. A prayer book for wartime, entitled The Shield of Faith, to assist in making this hour, will be gladly sent free to anyone who asks for it.
Returning now to our theme, instead of the present order which says, "What do I get out of this?" men will ask in a Christian order, "What service can I render to my country?" Freedom, fellowship, and service. These are the principles of a Christian social order derived from the basic principle that man is a creature of God, destined after a life of free service to enjoy eternal fellowship with divine love. And in order to build up this new world, we must begin thinking in a new way. Just as totalitarianism will not and cannot be defeated by thinking in the same grooves which led to it, so neither can the selfishness, the egotism, and the class conflicts of our social order be conquered by patching up the principles which produced it. Why is it so important to start with an entirely new set of principles and a new standard of values? Because if we do not, we will end only by shifting power and booty and loot from one class to another, instead of working for the good of all. This war, thank heavens, is the end of the economic man. And by the economic man, I mean the man whose basic principle was the primacy of profit. But unless we accept Christian principles based on the primacy of person and the common good, we will see a new kind of man, the enthronement of the political man. This is where irreligious revolutions, such as Marxian socialism and Nazism, end, in the substitution of the acquisitiveness of power for the acquisitiveness of money. And the political man, whose God is power, can be just as lustful, just as avaricious, as the economic man whose God is money. The decent human person has little to choose between the two. And either we will restore this Christian order based on the dignity of the human person, or we will shift from a regime dictated by economics to a regime dictated by politics. This war, and let us not mistake it, is an expression of a world disease. It will avail us not to give this old order in which we live artificial respiration, for we are giving it to a corpse. Let us wear no widow's weeds of mourning because our superstitions are being carried to the grave. Rather should we be putting on our wedding garments to court a new world and a new order in a renewed divine justice. If the old order of politicians, who promise to the electorate everything it wants, from pillaging the treasury to new tires and more sugar, is dead, then God be thanked. Let it perish. If the old world of capitalism, which thinks that property rights means the right to accumulate profits uncontrolled by the common good and the rights of organized labor, if this order is dead, God be thanked. Let it perish. If the old order of labor organizations, which thinks that there is no minimum to hours of work and no maximum to salary demands, and which would paralyze a national industry for 5 days because it refused to pay a 5-cent transportation fee, if that kind of world is dead, God be thanked. Let it perish. If the old world, where a college education was a social necessity instead of being what it ought to be, an intellectual privilege, is dead, God be thanked. Let it perish. For when our boys come home from the battlefronts of the world,
they will share none of these old ideas. Every one of these boys will want a job, and they will have a right to that job whether they belong to a union or not. And there is not a single one of these boys who will admit that the indispensable condition of working is that he belongs to a union. Every one of them will want a just wage and the right to raise a family in comfort and decency. And they will not admit that these personal and family rights are subject to and conditioned upon bondholders receiving 6% interest on their investments. Every one of the boys that are in the armed forces today will have lived through a day when capital ruled and also when labor ruled. And because they are fighting for neither while they are at war, they will not stand for the domination of either in peace. They will fill up a great vacuum in our economic and political life. For they will fight for the common good, in which the uncommon man of capital and the common man of organized labor will both be subject to the resurrection of justice under God. And with God on the side of these boys, who shall stand against them?
Today's program will consist of music by a unit of the Polished Choristers and an address by Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen. Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen of the Catholic University of America will now deliver the 7th in his series of 17 addresses on the crises in Christendom. His discourse today is entitled, "The Christian Order and the Family." I present Monsignor Sheen.
Friends, the disintegration of the family in our national life is one of our major tragedies. Courtship takes place outside of the home, often in a crowded room with a low ceiling, amid suffocating smoke, whilst listening to a tom-tom orchestra glamored by a girl who invariably cannot sing. The wife listens to radio serials with their moans, groans, and commercials, where triangles are more common than in a geometry book. She reads magazine articles written by women who never stay at home, saying, "A woman's place is in the home." The family Bible recording dates of birth and baptism is no longer existent, because few read the Bible, few give births, and few are ever baptized. One of the most evident symptoms of the breakdown of the family is divorce. The universalizing of easy divorce by the recent decision of the United States Supreme Court means that the institution of marriage is slowly degenerating into state-licensed free love. Polygamy and polyandry are recognized today on condition that husbands and wives, as the case may be, do not harness other husbands or wives together to the coach of their egotism, but that they hitch them up in tandem fashion or single file. If our courts continue to disrupt this natural unity of a nation, they will incapacitate us for international fellowship. For if we destroy this inner circle of loyalty through disloyalty, how shall we build up those larger international circles of loyalty from which world peace is derived? I sometimes wonder if it really does any good for a Christian to argue against the modern pagan who believes that divorce is legitimate and that marriage is a terminable pact of selfish fancy. Like two women arguing over back fences, we are arguing from different premises. The majority of people who are opposed to the stability and continuity of family life do not believe in the moral law of God. They believe that man is only an animal, or that morality is self-interest, or that if there is a God, he never intended that we should not do as we please. Now, once you start with these principles, then certainly divorce is right. Then certainly we should shirk sacrifices. If we are only beasts and love is sex, then there's no reason in the world why anyone should assume responsibility. But why not go all the way? By the same principle, anything is right if I can get away with it. If bonds between husband and wife are revocable at will and for the advantage of self-love, why should not the treaties between nations be revocable at the will of either party? If a husband may steal the wife of another man, why should not Germany steal Poland? If John Smith can break his treaty to take Mary Jones until death, who shall say that Italy is wrong in breaking its treaties with Ethiopia, or that Japan is wrong in seizing Manchuria? If divorces from marital contracts, why not divorces from international contracts? If in domestic society moderns sneer at marital fidelity as bourgeois virtue, what right have they to ask that bourgeois virtue be recognized in world society? To those who spend life's treasures amidst the ruin of broken fidelities, there will one day come a haunting conscience. As John Davidson put it, your cruelest pain is when you think of all the honeyed treasure of your body spent and no new life to show. Though then you feel how people lift their hands against themselves and taste the bitterest of the punishment of those whom pleasure isolates. Sometimes when darkness, silence, and the sleeping world gives vision scope, you lie awake and see the pale, sad faces of the little ones who should have been your children as they press their cheeks against your windows, looking in with piteous wonder, homeless, famished babes, denied your wombs and bosoms. Now set in contrast to this pagan view of marriage, the 7 principles of the Christian order in the family. First, marriage is one and unbreakable until death, both naturally and supernaturally. Naturally, because there are only 2 words in the vocabulary of love: you and always. You, because love is unique. Always, because love is eternal. Supernaturally, it is unbreakable, because the union of husband and wife is modeled upon the union of Christ and his church, which endures through the agelessness of eternity. Second, the foundation of marriage is love, not sex. Sex is physiological and of the body. Love is spiritual and therefore of the will. Since the marriage contract is rooted not in the emotions but in the will, it follows that when the emotion ceases the contract is not dissolvable. For the love of the will is not subject to the vicissitudes of passion. In any case, a lifetime is not too long for two people to become acquainted with each other. Marriage should be a series of perpetual and successive revelations, the sounding of new depths, the manifestation of new mysteries. At one time, and at first, there is the revelation of the mystery of the other's incompleteness, which can be known but once, because capable of being completed but once. At another time, the mystery of the other's mind, and later on, the mystery of fatherhood and motherhood, which before never existed, and finally, the revelation of the mystery of being shepherds for little sheep, ushering them into the Christ who is the door of the sheepfold. And third, love by its nature is not exclusively mutual self-giving. It would end in exhaustion, consumed in its own useless fire. Rather, it is mutual self-giving which ends in self-recovery. As in heaven the natural bond of father for son recovers itself in the Holy Ghost, who is the bond of unity, so too the natural mutual love of spouse for spouse recovers itself in the child, who is the incarnation of their mutual self-giving. All love ends in an incarnation, even God's. Fourth, every child is a potential nobleman of the kingdom of God. And parents are to take that living stone from the quarry of humanity, cut and chisel it by loving discipline and sacrifice, mold it on the pattern of the Christ truth until it becomes a fit stone for the temple of God, whose architect is love. To watch a garden grow from day to day, especially if one has planted the seed himself and cared for it, deepens the joy of living. But it is nothing compared to the joy of watching other eyes grow, conscious of another's image in their depths. And fifth, at a time when the first wild ecstasies begin to fade, when the husband might be tempted to believe that another woman is more beautiful than his wife, and the wife might be tempted to believe that another husband is more chivalrous, then it is that God in his providence sends children. In each boy, the wife sees the husband reborn in all of his chivalry and strength. And in each girl, the husband sees the wife reborn in all her sweetness and joy and delicacy. The natural impulse of pride that comes with begetting, the new love that overblooms the memory of a mother's pain as she swings open the great portals of the flesh, and the joy of each linked creature's and the other's fruit are as so many beads in a rosary, binding them together in an ineffable and unbreakable union of love. And sixth, if the bringing of children into the world is today an economic burden, it is not because God's law is wrong. It is because our social system is wrong. Therefore, the state should remove the causes of that burden. The human must not be limited nor controlled to fit the economic, but the economic must be expanded to fit the human. And seventh, marital happiness is impossible without sacrifice. That is why, on this Valentine's Day, we speak of arrows and darts of love. Something that wounds our selfishness. But only religion can conquer selfishness, and that is why we have to pray. That is why I ask every Jew and Protestant and Catholic in the radio audience to make our daily holy hour of prayer and meditation that American family life may be restored. And in addition to making this hour, including Holy Communion, Catholics should also revive the old family custom of the rosary every night. Begin it tonight and keep the family together. Our little prayer books entitled The Shield of Faith to assist you in making these meditations are now ready. We'll send them to all who write for them free. Now, such is the Christian position concerning marriage, and one that outside of the church is very largely misunderstood. It's so often said, oh, they can marry again. They're not Catholics. Or we hear it said, the Catholic Church says divorce is wrong. No. 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 Divorce is not wrong because the church says it is wrong. Why does the church say it is wrong? Because Almighty God says it is wrong. There's not one God for Catholics and another for Hottentots. And all who violate the natural law will be punished by God. A modern pagan is no more free to break God's law than a Catholic. Why is it that everyone practically outside of the church associates the objection to divorce with the Catholic Church? Simply because the Catholic Church today is about alone in defending the natural law of God. And if a time ever comes when the church alone defendeth the natural truth that 2 and 2 make 4, the world would say, oh, that's a Catholic doctrine. I tell you that if the natural law continues to be defended almost alone by the church, a day will come when Catholics will have to be prepared to die for the truth that apples are green in the springtime and that it is wrong to poison mother-in-laws. Men and women of America, awake. Raise your altars to life and love while you have time. If you have not found the citadel of married happiness, it is because you have failed to lay siege to the outer walls of your own selfishness. The purpose of war is not the loot of the private soldier. Neither is the purpose of your marriage the loot of life. Like apostles, you have been sent out 2 by 2, not that you may just eat and drink and buy and sell, but that you may enrich the kingdom of God with life and with love, and not with death. The soil that takes the seed in the springtime is not unfaithful to its messiahship of harvest. And so neither must you play recreant to the responsibilities of love. The fires of heaven which have been handed down to you as to an altar have been given not for your own burning, but that you may pass on the torch, that other fires may climb back again to the heavens from which they came. If love were only a quest or a romance, it would be incomplete. On the other hand, if it were only a capture and an attainment, it would cease to rise. Only in heaven can these two ever be perfectly combined, that is to say, the joy of chase and the thrill of capture. For once having attained God, we will have captured something so infinitely beautiful that it will take an eternity of chase to sound its depths. But here on earth, God has given to you who are faithful in the sacrament a dim sharing in those joys, wherein two hearts in their capture conspire against their mutual impotence and recover the thrill of chase in following their young down all the roads that lead to the kingdom of God. It was a family in the beginning that drew a world of wise men and shepherds and Jews and Gentiles to the secret of eternal peace. It will be through the family again that America will be reborn. When the day comes, when mothers will consider it their greatest glory to be sacristans of love's fruit, and when fathers will regard it as their noblest achievement to be the stewards of love's anointed ones, and when children realize that nature set no limit to the number of uncles a man might have, but that a man can have only one mother. When we realize this, then America will be great with the greatness of the founding fathers and the greatness of a nation blessed by God. God love you.
Today's program will consist of music by a unit of the Paulist choristers and an address by Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen. Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen of the Catholic University of America will now deliver the 8th in his series of 17 addresses on the crises in Christendom. His discourse today is entitled, The Christian Order and Education. I present Monsignor Sheen.
Friends, there are 3 points we should like to make in today's broadcast. First, it is a sound American principle that democracy cannot function without religion and morality. Secondly, American democracy is not presently making provision for religion and morality. Hence, thirdly, the necessity of restoring religious education in order to preserve democracy. First, democracy cannot survive without religion and morality. This is implied in the 2nd paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, which is at the same time a declaration of dependence. For it states that our rights have come to us from God and therefore are unalienable. If our rights come to us from God as rays from the sun, does it not follow that only on condition that we preserve our dependence on God will we preserve our independence from tyranny? As George Washington, whose birthday we celebrate tomorrow, said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. And further support comes from Calvin Coolidge, who in 1928 stated, unless our people are thoroughly instructed in the great truths of religion, they are not fitted to understand our institutions or to provide them with adequate support. President Roosevelt, sensing the same need of religion for democracy, said in 1940, practical steps should be taken to make more available to children and youth through education the resources of religion as an important factor in the democratic way of life and in the development of personal and social integrity. Religion and morality, therefore,
are essential to democracy. Now that brings us to our second point. Namely, democracy at the present time is not making provision in education for religion and morality. About the only group to whom modern religion caters is the group that neither practices nor believes in any religion. As Walter Lippmann said, modern education is based on a denial that it is necessary or useful or desirable for the schools and colleges to transmit from generation to generation the religious and classical culture of the Western world. And Dr. Hutchins, the president of the University of Chicago, in June 1940 expressed exactly the same lament. In order to believe in democracy, he said, we must believe that there is a distinction between the true and false, the good and bad, and the right and wrong. Are we prepared to defend these principles? Of course we are not. For over 40 years and more, our intellectual leaders have been telling us that they are not true. Unquote. The White House Conference of 1940 stated that of the 30 million children in the United States between the ages of 5 and 17, 16 million received no religious education whatsoever. It was this growing irreligious element which worried and prompted President Roosevelt in 1940 to say, we are concerned about the children who are outside the reach of religious influences and are denied help in attaining faith in an ordered universe and in the fatherhood of God. Nicholas Murray Butler, president of Columbia University, commenting upon the fact that the pagan element alone in our population is given the benefit of tax money, said, even the formal prayer that opens each session of the United States Senate and each session of the House of Representatives, and which accompanies each inauguration of the President of the United States, would not be permitted in a tax-supported school. That from Dr. Butler. If this condition of ignoring religion and morality existed in less important matters, it would have been remedied long ago. If, for example, it had been discovered that the geography of Russia was left out of our schools, oh, how quickly it would be inserted. Why is nothing done about that which our tradition says is the indispensable condition of democracy? And that brings us now to our third point, the necessity of restoring religious education in order to preserve democracy. Democracy demands that education satisfy not only the atheist, but also the believer in God. For that reason, those interested in the preservation of democracy have suggested that some assistance be given those schools, Episcopalian, Methodist, Baptist, Catholic, Jewish, and others, who are aiding democracy by teaching religion. As Dr. Hutchins put it, the states may, if they choose, assist pupils to attend the schools of their choice. Since we want all American children to get as good an education as they can, since we know that some children will not voluntarily attend public schools, and since we are not prepared to compel them to do so, it is in the public interest to give states permission to use federal grants to help them go to the schools they will attend and to make these schools as good as possible. What possible objection is there to this idea? To this democratic idea that equal opportunities for education be given to all along religious and cultural lines? Well, there's one objection which is rather common. It is this: education should be neutral. And by neutral, the intelligentsia mean that religion should not be taught. Now, this is a fallacy. The fact is, there is no such thing as neutral education. That is to say, an education without morality and religion. Religion and morality are not related to education like raisins to a cake, but like a soul to a body. There can be a cake without raisins, but there cannot be a man without a soul. If education does not inculcate a moral outlook, it will inculcate a materialist, or a communist, or a fascist, or a Nazi outlook. Neutrality is absolutely impossible in education. By the mere fact that religious and moral training is neglected, non-religious, non-moral, and in consequence anti-religious and anti-moral ideology is developed. No indoctrination of religion really means indoctrination of doubt and unbelief. Religion is either included or excluded in education. Hence, a school from which religion is excluded is bound to become irreligious. Now, there is a second objection against extending democracy in education to those who believe in God and morality, and it is this: America was founded on the principle of the separation of the church and the state. This is absolutely true. And we have no desire to change this principle. But our country was not founded on the principle of the separation of religion and the state. Our founding fathers intended that no particular religion should be the national religion, but they never intended that the state should be devoid of religion. It never entered their minds that we would grow up to be a near-religious nation, nor did they ever think that education would one day be divorced from God and His commandments. This is evident from the fact that no signer of the Declaration of Independence was educated in a non-religious school. For a century, the United States did not have a president who was educated in a non-religious school. It is true that the First Amendment of the Constitution forbade the establishment of any religion as a national religion, but that was because there was an established religion in 10 of the 13 colonies, the Congregational religion in 3, and the Episcopalian in 7. But the disestablishment of a particular church was not the disestablishment of religion. The fact is that religious schools, Methodist, Presbyterian, Jewish, Episcopalian, Catholic, are in the tradition of true, sound Americanism. It is the non-religious schools that are outside of that glorious tradition. But why do we insist so much on religious education? Because we are entering into an era of history wherein the grave threat to man's freedom will be from the omnipotent state. And once a nation ceases to believe, it begins to obey. As William Penn said, man must be governed by God, or he will be ruled by tyrants. We are coming into the days of omnipotence, where we will live either under the omnipotence of God or squirm under the omnipotence of the state. And godless education has no power to restrain a godless state. For example, when Hitler came into power in 1933, the very first to capitulate were the professors. But the one force which did not surrender was religion, as the Catholic bishops and Pastor Niemöller bear witness. It was the professors who allowed the independent administration of the universities to be abolished. The universities offering no objection to state-elected rectors and deans who were forced upon them by the Nazis. It was indeed a bitter disappointment for all who considered the German universities the defenders of rights and justice. But when one considers that specialization had been carried to such an extreme, and the unified philosophy of life so universally abandoned, it was no surprise that there was no one idea left around which the universities could rally. Given a crisis in any country in the world in which totalitarianism threatens the liberty of the citizens, and the first to capitulate will be the non-religious educators. How could it be otherwise? For without a faith, how can they oppose a faith? It will be only those schools that recognize the soul and its creator that will challenge the state which attempts to absorb the soul. Why, therefore, I ask you, impose excessive burdens on those schools which are the safeguard of American freedom and democracy? There's no reason in the world why any school in the United States which teaches religion and morality should be penalized for being patriotic. Nor why it should bear all the expenses of giving to the nation the two supports without which, as George Washington told us, a nation cannot endure. It is not fair. It is not democratic to cater only to the non-religious in education. A child who goes to a religious school may walk on the streets maintained by public funds, but in many instances in the United States, he may not ride to school in a bus that is operated at public expense. The state will build a chapel for citizens when they get into a penitentiary. How about building a few schools to prevent them from getting into a penitentiary? We are preparing an army of at least 7.5 million men to defend Christian liberty and justice on the battlefields. How about telling them something about that Christian liberty before we give them a gun? A government of the people, for the people, and by the people should respect the will of those who believe in religion and morality, even though they be in the minority. For democracy is not the custodian of majority privileges. It is the preserver of minority rights. Would it not be a good idea for America to cease talking about the right to worship and to begin talking about the duty to worship? We may need God's help, and need it very badly before this war is over, and it's not too soon to begin asking for it now.
For 150 years, we have been celebrating our Bill of Rights. How about teaching the young our Bill of Duties? The first 10 amendments to the Constitution are our Bill of Rights. The 10 commandments of God are our Bill of Duties. And to this end, we beg the Jews and the Protestants and Catholics and the radio audience to spend an hour a day in prayer and meditation for victory and for peace, that our democracy may be preserved by a return to God. To anyone who desires a prayer book suitable for wartime, write to us and we will send it to you free. Given another generation of godless education, and we will be in danger of tyranny. Given religion and morality in education, and we will be the most potent government influence for peace in the world. Then will America be great, and we will love it, not because it is great, but it will be great because we love it in the name of God, and that makes anything great. Not very long ago, a Nazi soldier in occupied France took his French wife and expectant mother into a hospital. Seeing a crucifix on the wall, the Nazi ordered the nun to take it down. She refused. He ordered her again, saying, "I want no child of mine ever to look upon the image of Christ." So the nun, under threat, took it down. And the father's wish was fulfilled to the letter. The child was born blind. And God grant that we may never deny to our American children the right to gaze upon the image of the Savior of the world.
Today's program will consist of music by a unit of the Polish choristers and an address by Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen. Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen of the Catholic University of America will now deliver the 10th in his series of 17 addresses on the crises in Christendom. His discourse today is entitled, "How Overcome This Evil." I present Monsignor Sheen.
Friends, in this series up to this time, we have said that this war is not a conflict of nationalities, but of philosophies of life. The philosophies of life which are intrinsically evil are Nazism, fascism, communism, and a nationalism which identifies itself with deity. How overcome this evil? In order to answer that question, one must know the strength of the enemy. In all human forces, there are two factors, physical and psychological. The first determines the ability to fight. The second, the zeal with which one fights. From a purely physical point of view, our enemies are well armed, technically perfect. But their great strength lies in a psychological factor. They believe in an absolute. They have a dogma, a creed, a faith, and a religion. That pseudo-religion centers about a race, an emperor, a Caesar, or a corpse. But in its essence, they are all the same. The affirmation of another absolute than God. Call it fanaticism, call it diabolical. The fact of the matter is they are men of faith. The Nazis, for example, have faith in the primitive purity of their race.
faith in the messianic call to be the masters of the world. And from that faith has come those unpentecostal fires which in the course of less than 10 years has swept them into the fury of the strongest army the world has ever seen. It is no answer to say that their faith is false. Certainly it is. It is like the faith of the demons in hell. But without a faith, nothing can be accomplished. It is the faith of the demons which inspires them to the ceaseless energy of the destruction of the kingdom of God, as it is the faith of the saints that inspires them unto its building. Whence has come this fanaticism for an absolute? It is the manifestation in a false form of a zeal which men should have had for the true faith. For the last 2 centuries, it has been the fault of the Western world to ridicule zeal for religion. Tolerance which should have been applied to persons was transferred to truths, so that men became indifferent to right and wrong and to truth and error. And zeal which men should have had for the true God could not long be kept chilled and frozen by indifference and by our so-called broad-mindedness, and it finally swept up through the surface and came out as fanaticism for false gods. The young people in these totalitarian countries were dissatisfied with the husks of our secularist culture. They wanted an absolute, one that would command conviction, a hearty wine of sacrifice, and they found it in a religion which was anti-religion. Their answer to a civilization that had forgotten the Christian religion was to be anti-Christian. They sought to erect a counter-church of the city of man, which would war against the city of God until the end of time. And that is why the world today is in the peculiar mood of having more energy for the spread of false gods of race and class and of power than it has for the spread of the knowledge of the true God and His life and His love. It is this faith of the enemies which explains the zest with which they fight. It explains why Japanese aviators believe that their death is the condition of their God's victory, and why young Nazi soldiers ask when they die that the inscription upon their tombstones reads, "He died in peace with Hitler." The human heart must have an absolute. As Voltaire has said, if man has no God, he will make a God for himself. Deny men the right to make a pilgrimage to the shrine of a saint, and in 50 years they will be making pilgrimages to a tank factory. Deny them a God incarnate, and in a few generations they will adore an emperor who is the incarnation of a God. The totalitarian powers have convinced us that man cannot live without a religion or a faith or an absolute. The question, therefore, no longer is, will we or will we not have an absolute? The only question is, which one will we serve? This very enthusiasm for false gods which they have is the explanation of their cruelty. There is nothing temporal that can bear the strain of being deified. It is like placing a marble bust on the stem of a rose. It distorts a man like beating a cripple with his own crutches. Endow a machine with infinite power, and it will kill you. Endow a finite human being with the power of God, and he will slay you. As Lord Acton said, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And as Chesterton said, speaking of the horrors of the new religion, God is more good to the gods that mocked him than men are good to the gods they made. When, therefore, a man with an eternal destiny is enlisted in the service of an earthly absolute, he becomes the fiercest and most fanatical soldier. And therein lies the total strength of our enemies. Their cause is a religion, the animal religion of a false god. And our problem is how overcome that absolute. This is one way we will not do it, not by hate. There is a group in our midst who, feeling the lack of a crusading spirit and sensing the need of zest in battle, contend that the condition of victory is the hatred of enemies. Hatred is a poor alternative for faith. It inspires men to fight because their enemy is wicked, rather than because their cause is righteous. It looks to the poison of their arrows, rather than to the justice of their archery. Lamenting the wickedness of our enemies will make us cruel, but it will never make us strong. I would rather think that our soldiers were inspired more by a love of the country they live in than by the country they hate. If we spend our time setting on the eggs of hate, in vain will we expect to hatch the dove of peace. And this absolute of theirs will not be overcome by force alone either. For no idea can be killed by force. A false idea can be overcome only by a true idea. A false dogma only by a true dogma. When Hitler says the power of money is dead, we must not counter with the defense of financial plutocracy, but rather with a new idea in which money shall be used exclusively as a medium of exchange. When Hitler says that the power of monopolistic capitalism is dead, we must not defend its abuses. We must counter with a new idea of economics based on the moral order. We cannot conquer Hitler's new order by attempting to preserve the old order from which it came. The one and only effective way is to build a new order ourselves, one grounded on the true absolute of God and the principles of justice and morality. Neither will we overcome this false absolute by an indifference to any absolute, or by saying that we are fighting merely to preserve the status quo. I know of a simple soul, one being asked the meaning of the word status quo, defined it rather correctly as the mess that we are in. We are not fighting to keep the world just as it was. If we were, we would be fighting to preserve a world that produced Nazism and communism and fascism. No vague sentiments about liberalism. No catchwords about freedom of the press. No American sportsmanship transplanted from the football field to a sea or a foxhole. No mass production, however great the 8-hour sacrifice of those who make it. No boasting and bragging. No complaining or haranguing of our public officials, and no change of legislators will carry us safely through this crisis unless we are prepared to give up our coat in time of fire and our cargo in case of a sinking ship. The Savior was right when he spoke of the crisis that faced Jerusalem, "Go not back for your coat. Let it perish." The strength of our enemies is in their absolute. Our weakness is in the want of it. Their force is their ideology. Our weakness is the lack of it. They are sweeping ahead because they have dogmas, and we are falling behind because we have none. The dynamism of a false paganism cannot be overcome by the irreligion of democracy. The enthusiasm for false gods cannot be drowned by an indifference to the true God. No secularized, non-religious theory of political freedom is strong enough to overcome their faith. A people who lack the strength of an ultimate conviction cannot overcome their false dogmas. The effective answer to a false religion is not indifference to all religion. Unless there is a positive conviction to pit against the assaults of the demon, the citadel of our soul will fall. What we need, above all things else, is the offensive of a great idea. Is there a place for it in American democracy? Certainly there is. Democracy is based on a political and an economic relative, but on a theological absolute. Does not our Declaration of Independence affirm that the Creator has endowed man with certain unalienable rights? In other words, God is the absolute in American democracy. And either democracy will rest on this divine foundation, or it will be laid to rest. Trying to preserve freedom and democracy without God, in whom alone these truths are grounded, is like preserving the false teeth of a drowning man. If we save the man, we will save his teeth. And if we save our souls in God, we will save our democracy and our freedom, but not otherwise. Now Lent begins this coming Wednesday. And let it be a season for Catholics to prove by additional sacrifices their love of God and their love of country. May Catholics take a resolution to attend Mass every morning during Lent, receive our Divine Lord into their hearts in Holy Communion, and prolong the thanksgiving, if possible, into a holy hour. May the Jews and Protestants in like manner spend an hour in meditation and prayer for the same intention. And to all who wish little booklets to aid in this meditation and prayer, we will gladly send them to you free. But pray we must. For as Shakespeare said, "If that the heavens do not quickly send down their visible spirits to tame these vile offenses, it will come that humanity must perforce prey on itself like monsters of the deep." Now this is the issue involved in the war, the choice of absolutes. No one has stated it among the United Nations quite as clearly as the Nazis have put it. In a book that was published in Berlin recently, entitled "God and the Race, A Soldier's Creed," we read this statement of Nazi ideology. Each epoch has its symbols. Two epochs and two symbols are now facing each other: the cross and the sword. Today, Christianity is under the sign of the cross. Our struggle is not against man. It is against an idea. We struggle against the cross. That is Nazism.
And that is one of the clearest expressions that has yet come from any nation in this world war. The Nazis say they are on the side of the sword. They put us on the side of the cross. So be it. And may a day come then, when Hitler reaches out his sword to us, that we, in virtue of our recovery of the absolute, will be strong enough to take that naked blade in our bare hand and pull it from him and lift the sword high in the air with the hilt above, and watch that hilt frame against the august blue of heaven's sky the glorious symbol of the cross of Christ and the pledge of American victory.